Case 1. Sarah Marie Johnson. On the morning of September 2nd, 2003, Alan and Diane Johnson were found fatally shot in their own home. Sarah, their 16-year-old daughter, was the only other person in the house. Initially, she claimed she'd awakened and found her parents already lying in bed, shot. But over time, her story shifted in key details, raising suspicion. Forensic detectives worked methodically. They collected a discarded bathrobe and latex glove from the driveway trash, and a leather glove in the garbage that bore gunshot residue. Inside Sarah's bedroom, investigators found the matching glove of the pair. Those items tied her to the crime scene. They also established that Sarah had access to the guest house where a rifle, later identified as the murder weapon, was stored. Sarah had been in a relationship with 19-year-old Bruno Santos, which her parents reportedly disapproved of. It was argued at trial that she feared they would expose him to legal or immigration consequences. But evidence alone is rarely enough. The investigation probed her mental state, any prior emotional warning signs, and the consistency of her accounts under interrogation. Sarah's age placed her at a critical developmental stage. At 16, the adolescent brain is still maturing in impulse control and emotional regulation. Her defense later emphasized a history of clinical depression and even a prior suicide attempt, factors that suggested her emotional vulnerability. At sentencing, the state's expert, Dr. Richard Wurst, testified that despite her crime, she had the potential to rehabilitate. However, the court ultimately rejected that argument in imposing her sentence. Her shifting statements, while not inherently proof of guilt, became a focus. The prosecution argued these inconsistencies undermined her credibility and pointed toward consciousness of guilt. The defense, on the other hand, pressed that her emotional state, youth, and pressure from parental disapproval had led to an impulsive tragedy, not calculated malice. In March 2005, a jury convicted Sarah of 2 counts of first-degree murder. In June, during sentencing, the court imposed fixed life sentences without the possibility of parole. 2 concurrent life terms plus a 15-year enhancement for the firearm use. The court acknowledged her youth, but judged that the severity and planning of the act warranted no early release. She appealed, arguing a host of legal errors, including ineffective assistance of counsel and problems in jury instructions. The Idaho Supreme Court upheld her conviction in 2008. Years later, Sarah sought post-conviction relief, citing the U.S. Supreme Court's rulings in Miller v. Alabama, 2012, and Montgomery v. Louisiana, 2016, which limit life without parole sentences for juveniles unless the offender is irreparably corrupt. She argued that Idaho's fixed life terms for juveniles violated constitutional protections, given her youth and capacity for change. But Idaho courts rejected her claims. They held the sentencing court had adequately considered her youth, and that her case did not demand a different outcome under the Miller standard. In a more recent appeal to the Ninth Circuit in 2024, her petition for habeas relief was denied. Sarah Marie Johnson remains incarcerated at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. Her life sentence, especially being imposed on a juvenile, continues to provoke debate over youth accountability, rehabilitation, and constitutional limits. Case 2. Carly Madison Gregg. In the spring of 2024, in Brandon, Mississippi, Ashley Smiley, a 40-year-old math teacher, returned home from school with her daughter. That daughter, Carly Gregg, had been reported by a friend earlier that day, because Ashley had learned of hidden vape pens, burner phones, and marijuana use in her daughter's room. What unfolded next was captured by home surveillance and became central to the prosecution's narrative and the defense's battle in court. The footage showed Carly pacing, hiding something behind her back, then entering her mother's room. 3 gunshots rang out. Ashley Smiley died. In the minutes afterward, Carly walked into the kitchen, hid the weapon, picked up her mother's phone, and used it to text her stepfather, posing as Ashley to ask, "When will you be home, honey?" Simultaneously, she messaged a friend, saying there was an emergency, and when that friend arrived, she asked them, "Have you ever seen a dead body?" before leading them to Ashley's body. In a chilling twist, when her stepfather arrived, Carly shot him as well. He was hit in the shoulder. And then a struggle ensued. He wrestled the weapon away, and within hours Carly was arrested nearby. This case was never about who pulled the trigger. The surveillance video made that clear. Rather, The central battleground was Carly's mental state at the moment she acted. The defense did not dispute that she had committed the act. Instead, they mounted a not guilty by reason of insanity case. On the stand, Dr. Andrew Clark, a child psychiatrist testifying for the defense, described Carly as battling symptoms of depression, dissociation, self-harm, and auditory hallucinations that were intensifying. He testified that the medication she had recently been prescribed left her feeling emotionally numb, and that she later claimed her memory of the event went blank. The defense argued that the pressures of secret behavior, the confrontation with her mother, and a fragile mental state converged into a crisis no adolescent should face. But the prosecution rejected the notion that Carly lost touch with reality. State psychiatrists and experts invoked Mississippi's legal standard for insanity. Rooted in the Monocton rules, a defendant must prove she did not understand the nature of her act, or could not distinguish right from wrong. The state's expert, Dr. Jason Pickett, asserted that Carly knowingly planned parts of her act, such as hiding the gun, sending luring messages, and removing a surveillance camera. He described narcissistic traits, calling her behavior diabolical, and emphasized that she had demonstrated awareness, planning, and concealment. The jury was asked to consider, did she cross a line into legal insanity, or did she remain responsible? The trial lasted 5 days. Witnesses included the stepfather, law enforcement, forensic experts, and both defense and prosecution psychiatrists. On September 20, 2024, the jury delivered a verdict: guilty on first-degree murder, attempted murder, and tampering with evidence. The next day, she was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 10 years for evidence tampering. In court, Carly broke down in tears, publicly grieving her fate while reporters described the prosecution's lament. Sometimes evil comes in young packages. Carly's defense team appealed, filing motions for a new trial and alleging prior counsel misconduct and newly revealed evidence, such as statements from her biological father about her early hallucinations and equine therapy history. A judge denied the new trial request, ruling the evidence would not likely change the verdict. As of now, Carly remains in the Youthful Offender Unit of the Central Mississippi Correctional Facility. Case 3, Sarah Grace Patrick. On February 20, 2025, in Carroll County, Georgia, law enforcement responded to a distress call. Sarah Grace Patrick had dialed 911, reporting that her mother, 41-year-old Kristen Brock, and stepfather, 45-year-old James Brock, had been shot in their home. The children in the household were still inside, and a younger sister, about 6 years old, is said to have discovered the parents. Over the following months, investigators triangulated a timeline of movements, social media activity, and digital footprints, slowly narrowing in. Authorities say they amassed what they described as mountains of evidence linking Patrick, though details remain under seal. In July 2025, a warrant was issued and Patrick surrendered. What might lead a teenager to allegedly kill her own parents? That is the psychological tension at the heart of the case, and the hardest to resolve. To date, prosecutors have not publicly disclosed a compelling motive. The defense has seized on this void, arguing that without motive, the prosecution's narrative is incomplete. Patrick reached out to TikTok influencers and true crime bloggers in the months after the murders, soliciting coverage and claiming she could provide intel. In one message, she said a story on her parents' case would be a really big hit. That type of outreach raises questions about self-presentation, external validation, and the desire to control narrative. Still, absence of direct weapon evidence is emphasized by her family. Her grandfather publicly questioned whether any physical proof directly put the gun in her hand. Her father also stated she had no criminal history or prior red flags. This case may involve motivations not easily visible: identity crisis, loyalty conflicts, internalized anger, or desperation for attention or control. If the outreach to influencers suggests something, it could be a mix of guilt, performance, and pleading for narrative ownership. Forensic psychologists will likely be called to parse whether behaviors like grief displays or social media theatrics bear genuine emotion or mask intent. In August 2025, a grand jury convened in Carroll County and returned an 8-count indictment against Patrick, charging her with 2 counts each of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. Immediately, she faced a contentious bond hearing, in which prosecutors pressed for her to be detained without bail. In court, Emotional pleas were heard from both sides. Some family members supported her release, citing her youth, church involvement, and lack of prior offenses. Others insisted she posed serious risks, that she might flee or attempt to intimidate witnesses, especially given her digital savviness and prior outreach online. Judge Dustin Hightower sided with the prosecution, denying bond. His written decision flagged her as a significant flight risk and potential danger to witnesses. During the hearing, Patrick wept, dabbed tears, and appeared emotionally fragile. The judge also pledged to keep the case moving swiftly, tentatively setting a trial date of January 5, 2026. As the case approaches trial, both sides will present starkly different narratives. Prosecutors are expected to lean heavily on digital evidence, social media posts, the timeline of messages, influencer outreach, and perhaps metadata placing Patrick at key moments. The funeral eulogy she delivered has already been scrutinized, with some experts arguing it betrayed unusual phrasing or emotional distance. The defense will likely attack the lack of clear motive, challenge the chain of custody for any physical evidence, and argue the possibility of alternate actors or misinterpretation of digital signals. They may bring mental health experts and character witnesses to challenge the assumption that the teenage mind acted with premeditated intent. If convicted, sentencing in Georgia for malice murder and related counts could result in life, or even multiple life terms, depending on how many charges are upheld. Rehabilitation arguments will be crucial. The defense may push for youth-centered interventions, psychological counseling, and gradual reforms, rather than only punitive measures. Meanwhile, prosecutors will argue for accountability and community safety. Case 4. Stephanie Barron. Stephanie Barron was, by many accounts, a bright and accomplished teenager. Friends and teachers described her as intelligent, social, and well-behaved. But behind that facade, tensions had been forming at home. Stephanie had begun a romantic relationship her parents disapproved of. They imposed strict limits on her freedoms, monitoring her interactions and pressuring her to break off or control aspects of the relationship. Over time, resentment built. Quiet arguments, withheld trust, and perceived barriers between her desires and parental authority. On that fateful Christmas morning, authorities responded to a 911 call and discovered Stephen and Carla Barron fatally shot in their home. Stephanie initially claimed that an intruder broke in and carried out the killings. That narrative was a predictable first line for someone in shock or guilt, but it would not hold. Investigators quickly found key evidence. A bloody T-shirt was discovered in her bedroom closet. The murder weapon hidden nearby was linked to her. Text messages and correspondence between Stephanie and her boyfriend revealed resentment toward her parents and detailed frustration with their restrictions. No signs of forced entry, no theft, no external motive beyond internal family conflict. The pieces began to converge, and the intruder theory fell apart. Detectives combed the crime scene for inconsistencies. They documented entry points, ballistic trajectories, and absence of defensive wounds or struggle to suggest forced invasion. They traced the sphere of relationships, friends, the boyfriend, acquaintances, to determine who might have assisted or known in advance. The T-shirt evidence was path-linked to her, and the hidden weapon suggested concealment rather than a chaotic intruder scenario. Additionally, investigators traced statements, alibis, and digital communications. The absence of corroborating support for Stephanie's version compounded the weight of physical evidence. Authorities also scrutinized how the weapon was obtained and whether others were complicit, particularly her boyfriend, Denario Jones, who had reportedly stolen the gun used in the crime and attempted to destroy evidence by setting fires. Stephanie ultimately pled guilty to capital murder in 2002, foregoing a full jury trial. In her plea, she accepted responsibility for the deaths of her parents rather than risk the uncertainties of trial. Prosecutors presented their evidence through formal statements and pretrial motions, illustrating motive, opportunity, and means. Defense counsel focused on her youth, emotional state, and possible mitigating factors rather than contesting the central facts. While Stephanie lacked a full trial transcript of cross-examination, the plea hearing allowed the court to hear a summary of the case, as well as victim impact statements from family or community members. The defense likely argued for leniency based on her age and potential for rehabilitation. The prosecution stressed the severity of premeditation and betrayal. At sentencing, Stephanie was given a term of 75 years in prison. The court weighed her admitted culpability, the emotional impact on the victim's extended family, and the nature of the planning involved. The sentence reflected both punishment and a recognition that such a breach of trust warranted a lengthy custodial period. Since then, there is limited public evidence of rehabilitation efforts or parole prospects. Because she pleaded guilty, she avoided full public trial exposure, which also constrains the clarity of her subsequent psychological progression in prison. But her case remains a reference point in discussions about teenage violence, family conflict, and early intervention. The Stephanie Barron case remains haunting not for its shocking violence, but for the betrayal and internal collapse it signals. A promising life turned tragic, 2 parents lost, and a community forced to confront the fragility of trust within a home. Through careful reporting, we examine not just what happened, but why. K5 Aaron Caffey. In rural East Texas, the Caffey family lived under the banner of faith. Terry and Penny Caffey and their 3 children were active in their church community. Aaron, homeschooled until shortly before the murders, had a role in worship and choir. She began dating 18-year-old Charlie Wilkinson while working part-time at a Sonic restaurant. The court of parental approval was strict. Aaron's parents insisted she break off contact after seeing alarming content on Charlie's MySpace page. According to publicly reported accounts, Aaron felt cornered. Either lose her relationship or take extreme steps. She was old enough to understand consequence, yet young enough to feel desperate. Some accounts claim that in the weeks before the murders, Aaron confided in friends about wanting her family dead so she could remain with Charlie. The decision to commit familicide is extreme, but when one feels trapped emotionally, the mind can rationalize unimaginable acts. That doesn't excuse it, but it helps explain the internal pressure. At about 3 a.m. on March 1, 2008, intruders forced their way into the Caffey home. They shot into the master bedroom, attacked the children upstairs, then set the home on fire. Terry Caffey was shot multiple times, but survived. He crawled, reportedly over a mile, to a neighbor's house to call for help. Investigators arrived to find charred remains, blood evidence, signs of forced entry, and Aaron missing. The missing daughter narrative was Aaron's initial claim. She said she had been kidnapped, but the FBI, local police, and crime lab began reconstructing timelines. Phone records, witness statements, and Aaron's own relationships were scrutinized. Investigators confronted the inconsistencies. Charlie Wilkinson and his associate Charles Wade had already been tied to Aaron by their interactions, and their confessions pointed back to a plotted scheme. Wilkinson and Wade each asserted that Aaron had ordered the hits, that she instructed them to eliminate her mother and brothers so she could be free. Their consistency, alongside forensic plus digital evidence, gradually reversed the narrative from victim to mastermind. Because of the gravity, all 4, Aaron, Wilkinson, Wade, and Bobby Johnson, who acted as getaway driver, were charged with capital murder. Even though Aaron was a minor, prosecutors chose to try her as an adult. Pretrial hearings debated her certification as an adult. Psychological evaluations and reports were ordered. The defense pointed to her age, possible emotional manipulation by Charlie, and her prior mental state. But the prosecution emphasized the planning, her documented statements, and the consistency of the confessions from the co-defendants. Rather than go to full jury trial, all pleaded guilty under plea deals. Aaron accepted 2 life sentences with parole eligibility after 43 years. Wilkinson and Wade were spared execution and given life without parole. Johnson received 40 years, with parole possible. During sentencing, Aaron's father, though devastated, intervened. He asked that no death penalty be pursued. That decision shows a rare intersection: faith, forgiveness, and legal mercy all meeting in one courtroom. In testimony, Wilkinson claimed Aaron insisted they murder her mother and siblings, saying, "I don't care, just do what you gotta do." He stated he warned her that her younger brothers would have to go, or they'd be witnesses. Aaron's defense narrative tried to discredit the motives and chain of command or suggest duress. But forensic timelines, phone logs, and consistency among co-conspirators undermined that. During sentencing, while the prosecutor described the crime's calculated nature, Aaron's father expressed a desire for redemption and mercy. Stating that execution would not restore lives, the judge accepted the plea and imposed life terms under Texas law. Aaron will be eligible for parole only decades into the future. Meanwhile, her father, Terry, took the path of forgiveness. He has spoken publicly about his journey, teaching about faith, trauma, and reconciliation. As of recent interviews, Aaron continues to deny full responsibility, claiming coercion or manipulation. But the record is strong. Multiple voices, evidence, and legal findings support her central role. This case is a chilling reminder that darkness can emerge even in devout households. Case 6. Jasmine Richardson. Born October 21, 1993, to parents Deborah and Mark Richardson, Jasmine had a younger brother, Tyler Jacob. Her family had struggled early with addiction but had rebuilt, moving to Madison, Alberta by 2005. Friends say she was once a well-liked and ambitious student, but as she entered early adolescence, Jasmine began embracing darker aesthetics, social media, and identity exploration. That transformation alone did not foreshadow violence, but the next turn would. In early 2006, Jasmine met Jeremy Allen Steinke, age 23. She was 12. Their relationship, kept secret from her parents, escalated quickly. Steinke described himself with ominous imagery, claiming to be a 300-year-old werewolf, even wearing a vial of blood around his neck. Some accounts say they met at a punk concert or via mutual friends. They later communicated online via forums like Nexopia. The age gap, power imbalance, and shared fixation on dark themes became a toxic pairing. As her parents discovered signs of rebellion and imposed restrictions, tensions rose. Jasmine grew resentful of parental controls. In her communications with Steinke, she is alleged to have floated dark ideas, hypothetical conversations about removing obstacles, making deaths look accidental or self-inflicted. She later testified that when she made such remarks, she didn't mean it. It was angry talk, she said. Meanwhile, Steinke made comments building on those themes. On April 23, 2006, police were called to the Richardson home. The bodies of Mark and Deborah were discovered in the basement. Tyler Jacob was found upstairs. Jasmine was not present, leading to early speculation she might be a victim or missing. But investigators would soon see her as a suspect. Inside Jasmine's school locker, staff found a stick figure drawing that appeared to depict her family being murdered. That chilling clue, paired with her absence and unsettling internet communications, made law enforcement focus on her as a primary suspect. The next day, Jasmine and Steinke were located in Leader, Saskatchewan, about 130 kilometers away. They were arrested, and evidence pointed to premeditation and coordination. Witnesses later testified Steinke said the family had been gutted like fish, and Jasmine described her brother's final moments, according to trial testimony. Investigators also pieced together that after the murders, Jasmine had used her mother's credit card, taken a taxi, and eventually met Steinke, even attending a social gathering later that same day. Under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, Jasmine's identity was initially protected, due to her age. In July 2007, now age 13 legally, Jasmine was tried. A jury deliberated just 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on 3 counts of first-degree murder. At the trial, the prosecution emphasized premeditation, emails, drawings, and statements she and Steinke made. Defense counsel argued she was under Steinke's dominant influence and was less culpable. Before sentencing, a psychological evaluation diagnosed conduct disorder and oppositional defiance disorder, but suggested she remained a candidate for rehabilitation. In November 2007, Judge Brooker delivered the maximum sentence possible under the law for someone her age. 10 years in an intensive rehabilitative custody regime, which included 4 years in a psychiatric institution and 4.5 years under conditional supervision in the community. Jasmine was credited for 18 months already served. Steinke was tried later, in November 2008. He was convicted by a jury of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced in December 2008 to life in prison, with parole eligibility after 25 years. During his incarceration, he legally changed his name to Jackson May. The prosecution had also charged a friend, Casey Lancaster, as an accessory. That charge was ultimately reduced. She pled guilty to obstruction and received a year of house arrest. Jasmine completed her sentence and was released on May 6, 2016. By that point, she had attended college courses during her sentence. At her final review, the judge said she had met rehabilitation goals, urging her to move forward by controlling her actions each day. The public, however, has remained divided. Some view her as a success story in youth justice. Others question whether juvenile sentencing limits are too soft when human lives are lost. Case 7. Jennifer Pan. From the start, Jennifer was under intense pressure. Her parents, Vietnamese immigrants who worked tirelessly to build security for their children maintained very high expectations. Academics, music lessons, public behavior, they monitored it all. To satisfy them, Jennifer cultivated a facade, forged report cards, doctored transcripts, false university admission letters. She told them she studied pharmacology at a top institution, volunteered at a children's hospital. None of it true. In private, she spent her days hiding in cafes, teaching piano, working in a restaurant. She secretly dated a man her parents disapproved of, and the lies piled up until she could no longer sustain them. She allegedly believed her only escape was lethal. Investigators initially treated the scene as a violent home intrusion. But anomalies stood out. Nothing of real value was stolen. Jennifer alone was unharmed. The house showed no forced entry. Meanwhile, her father, after waking from a medically induced coma, told police he saw Jennifer talking comfortably with one of the intruders. Then came the digital trail. Phones traced, text logs revealed over 100 messages between Jennifer and her ex-boyfriend, Danny Wong, in the hours leading to the attack. Wong, investigators believe, acted as the link between Jennifer and hired hitmen. Under third interrogation, police used the Reed technique and deception. They falsely claimed they had high-tech evidence placing her at the scene, and she eventually confessed she had hired men to kill her parents, though she insisted the plan was to kill herself. Her confession, though emotionally fraught, came after long interview sessions and tactics permissible in Canada's system. The trial began in March 2014 and stretched nearly 10 months. Over 200 exhibits and more than 50 witnesses took the stand. The Crown painted a clear narrative. Jennifer, motivated by inheritance and resentment, arranged a murder disguised as a home invasion. Her defense attempted to introduce alternative theories. Suicide attempt gone wrong, changed intent. But the judge only allowed 2 scenarios to go to the jury: a premeditated plot or a robbery-turned murder. The jury convicted Jennifer and co-conspirators of first-degree murder for her mother's death and attempted murder for her father's shooting. She and others were sentenced to life, with parole eligibility after 25 years. But the story didn't end there. In 2023, the Court of Appeal held that the trial judge erred by not allowing the jury to consider that only the father might have been the target, a scenario with air of reality. They ordered a retrial on the first-degree murder count, though her attempted murder conviction stood. In April 2025, Canada's Supreme Court upheld that decision. The jury should have been given broader options to decide lesser charges. The attempt to overturn her life sentence for attempted murder was dismissed. Today, Jennifer remains in prison at Grand Valley Institution for Women, awaiting a new trial. Her legal path forward involves redefining how the jury can view her intent. Case 8. Carrie Nurauder. In the early morning hours of August 28, 2017, investigators arrived at a quiet suburban home in Corning, New York. They were greeted not by a scene of chaos, but by unsettling stillness. A body was there. The case had the elements of domestic tragedy and manipulation. The victim, Michelle Nurauder, was found dead inside her home. Initial impressions, based on how the scene looked, suggested suicide. But investigators sensed contradictions. Neighbors, phone records, and traces of tampering raised doubts. The scene had signs of staging. Electrical devices unplugged, scuff marks inconsistent with a simple fall. The more detectives dug, the more the narrative unraveled. As investigators interviewed the family, the attention turned to the husband, Lloyd Nurauder, and one of their daughters, Carrie. The turning point came when Carrie, then about 20 years old, was arrested and later pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, admitting she assisted in her mother's killing. But more shocking than the admission was why, or rather, how Lloyd persuaded his daughter to become complicit. According to her plea, Lloyd gave Carrie an ultimatum: help him kill Michelle to relieve him of the burden of child support and alimony, or he would kill himself. Carrie said that on the day of the crime, she drove her father to and from Michelle's home, unplugged devices to erase traces, and distracted her younger sister while Lloyd carried out the act. In court, prosecutors focused on premeditation and planning. They portrayed not a spontaneous tragic act, but a calculated act of domestic violence and control. District Attorney Brooks Baker characterized the case as the ultimate domestic violence case, arguing that this was not a crime of passion. Carrie's testimony, as part of her plea, revealed inner turmoil about being forced to participate. She acknowledged her role while expressing remorse. The specter of her father's threat and her own emotional state weighed heavily in the defense strategy. In 2020, after serving a portion of her sentence, Carrie was paroled and released from prison. Her father, Lloyd, by contrast, received life in prison. The sentencing underscored a distinction in culpability. Carrie's cooperation and plea mitigated her punishment, while Lloyd's central role led to the harsher outcome. A plea bargain allowed the case to resolve without a full trial for Carrie, sparing her the uncertainty of a jury verdict. Meanwhile, Lloyd faced extensive felony charges, first-degree murder plus multiple counts, ensuring the state could pursue maximum accountability. During hearings, the severity of psychological manipulation, the planning elements, and the victim's life were all brought before the court for weighing. As we close, the Nurauder case is not just a story of blood and betrayal. It's a case study in human fragility under control. A cautionary tale of how manipulation can twist the wills of those we think we know best. Case 9. Jasmia and Tasmia Whitehead. In January 2010, 34-year-old Nikki Whitehead was found dead in her Conyers, Georgia home. Investigators quickly labeled it a killing by someone she knew, not a stranger. Her daughters, identical twins Jasmia Jazz and Tasmia Tas, were living with her under custody orders. The twins claimed they returned home that day to discover her body, but forensic evidence told a different story. According to their great-grandmother, Della Frazier, the twins had lived with her at times, resisting their mother's attempts to assert control. The relationship with Nikki had long been fraught. Disagreements over autonomy, dating, schooling, and behavior led to counseling, juvenile court appearances, and custody battles. One counselor described their family as thriving in chaos, a description that hints at a pattern of emotional instability, shifting control, and tension. By January 2010, Nikki had just regained full custody after a court-ordered 2-week trial period. The girls resented that decision. Psychologically, this setup suggests a rapidly escalating conflict in an emotionally volatile pair of siblings who perhaps felt cornered or powerless. Within months, authorities arrested the twins on May 21, 2010. Early on, they insisted they found their mother's body after returning from school. But investigators unearthed several telling clues. Bite mark evidence suggested Nikki, during a struggle, bit one or both daughters. DNA testing cleared Nikki's partner of involvement. The medical examiner classified the death as a crime of passion, not a random breaking in. Confronted with mounting forensic linkages and inconsistencies in their accounts, the twins gradually altered their story in interviews and interrogations. Investigators also used interrogation transcripts to press contradictions, emotional responses, and pressure points. Over time, each twin opted to accept a plea rather than face a full murder trial. In January and February of 2014, Tasmia and Jasmia each pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and related charges under a plea agreement. Each was sentenced to 30 years in prison, to be served in separate facilities. With credit for time served pre-sentencing, parole eligibility was scheduled, for Tasmia in 2026 and for Jasmia in 2027. During sentencing hearings, the court considered both the severity of the offense and the twins' youth, their psychological background, and the plea deal's risk reduction. The legal framing emphasized that, despite their age, the act was beyond a mere teenage escalation. It was a fatal act against their parent. The plea spared the state a lengthy, uncertain trial, but locked in stiff sentences. Inside prison, both twins are separated and housed in different Georgia Department of Corrections facilities. Tasmia at Arendale, Jasmia at Pulaski. Their tentative parole dates reflect an acknowledgement of their potential for rehabilitation, though 30 years is a heavy term for juveniles. Debate remains about whether longer sentences for youthful offenders impede their chance to reform or serve public safety. In interviews years later, observers have reflected on generational trauma, the pressures of adolescent identity in chaotic environments, and the need for early intervention in families with instability. The case invites reflection. When young people reach emotional breaking points, how do systems, school, counseling, family courts, step in before tragedy? Case 10. Dejonah Holmes. On the night of April 9, 2018, police were dispatched to a home on Belmead Road in Kansas City, Missouri. Inside, they found two adults, Kinderly Holmes, 37, and Brian Starr, 38, fatally shot. The initial 911 call had come from a different location. Dejonah, then just 15 years old, told the operator that a robbery had occurred in the house and that her parents had been shot. Later, in conversations with police, she shifted her account, first claiming her father shot her mother, and then that she had shot him in self-defense. Investigators noted odd clues almost immediately. Neighbors reportedly heard 3 gunshots that evening. A search warrant obtained by police allowed them to search Dejonah's phone, where they discovered disturbing patterns. Searches like scary movies where kids kill parents, rap lyrics expressing a desire for her father's death, and even a video of her holding a gun while dancing. In her bedroom, authorities also documented a hand-drawn stick figure depiction labeled "Me," shooting a figure labeled "Dad." Between the night of the shootings and Dejonah's arrest, a witness reported receiving calls from her, saying she needed help. The witness met her at a McDonald's, where she said her parents had been shot. He claimed he had to coax her into dialing 911. Meanwhile, Dejonah made 9 calls using her mother's phone after the incident, and waited nearly an hour to contact police. This mix of inconsistencies, behavioral data from her phone, and the stick figure drawing made investigators view her statements with deep suspicion. The investigation, from this point forward, would revolve around psychological profiling, forensics, and establishing motive. The online searches and lyrics suggested preoccupation with parricide themes, possibly echoing underlying anger or resentment. The presence of the stick figure drawing signaled symbolic rehearsal, a mental visualization of violent intent. Investigators often interpret such drawings not as mere fantasies, but as windows into internal conflict or plan. The shifting narrative Dejonah presented, first an external threat, robbers, then claiming her father shot her mother, then claiming she acted in defense, is consistent with behavior seen in high-stress deception. Conflicting stories intended to test how each version lands with investigators. Her delay in calling 911 and use of someone else's device to contact police also align with patterns seen when an individual is staging a scene or buying time. Beyond the factual clues, those close to her hinted at deeper family tensions. Her uncle later stated publicly that her mother had been abused by her father, though official court documents in the case do not explicitly reference domestic abuse allegations. Whether or not the abuse claims can be substantiated, they cast a shadow over the family dynamics and raise questions about motive, control, and psychological stressors. Shortly after, prosecutors filed formal charges. The complaint against Dejonah Holmes charged her with 2 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of armed criminal action, and tampering with physical evidence. Under Missouri law, a Class A felony murder conviction would carry a penalty between 10 and 30 years, or even life in prison, with eligibility for parole only after 85% of the sentence. Given her age, prosecutors sought to certify her as an adult, a move that would allow her to face the adult system. The judge accepted that certification. On bond, prosecutors initially sought $150,000. In some reporting, the defense or judge granted adjustment to lower amounts, and prosecutors indicated an intent to appeal bond decisions. During pretrial proceedings, expected areas of dispute would include Dejonah's capacity, her mental state at the time, admissibility of evidence from her phone, and whether any defense of abuse or provocation might mitigate culpability. As of available public records, it is not clear whether Dejonah Holmes has stood for a full jury trial, or if any final sentencing has been handed down. The public documentation largely consists of the initial complaint, press reporting, and statements by prosecutors and media. If a full trial occurred, central issues would likely focus on her credibility, forensic ballistic evidence linking the gun to each victim, trajectory analyses, timing of calls, and the defense's challenge to the narrative of premeditation. In court, testimony from forensic experts would be crucial. For example, determining whether shots were fired from close range, whether the gun she possessed matched the bullets, whether blood spatter or residue supports her versions of events. Defense psychology experts might be called to testify on her mental health, emotional trauma, or susceptibility under stress. She or her legal counsel might argue diminished capacity, self-defense, or even coercion. The prosecution would aim to show a planned act, drawing from the phone evidence, her digital searches, and the stick figure drawing. If convicted under the proposed charges, her sentence would likely require her to serve at least 85% of the term before eligibility for parole. under Missouri's statute. Whether rehabilitation programs or juvenile transition services would be available depends on the sentence structure, but given the severity, she would likely serve time in adult facilities. The story of Dejonah Holmes forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How does a child reach a point where violence seems like the only outlet? How does a system balance accountability with rehabilitation? And how can we recognize warning signs before tragedy unfolds?